Time to get to the. Where do you want me to go? Hey, Kay, when you can, give me control real quick. And I got praying about it, and man, it was Wednesday, and I still am not sure where we're headed. Sermons come. Like, here's the thing about preaching, okay? Sunday is always coming. Okay, always. And which means I have to be prepared every Sunday. Now, if you go to college for pastoral work, they're going to tell you you should have your sermons planned out 6 months in advance. Ha! Ha! Even when I was a youth pastor, I didn't have my curriculum planned out 6 months in advance. And I was a part-time youth pastor. I mean, come on. So Thursdays, Wednesday afternoons coming, I'm like, I don't know where we're going. But there's this, ever since I started praying and asking Lord, where do we go? This phrase kept coming to my mind from Mother's Day. Back in Mother's Day, we preached the first 2 chapters of 1 Samuel. Well, 1.5. But there was this verse, and that's verse 21 of chapter 2. It says, And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. And for whatever reason, that phrase, in the presence of the Lord, stuck out to me and kept with me all week. And I said, okay, Lord, do you want me to preach for Samuel, or do we need to go into the life of Samuel? And man, I started studying it, opening it up, and there is so much here. When you're talking, remember, our word for the year is service. We've spent a lot of time, right? We talked about how Jesus gave us the greatest service ever in the fact that He died on the cross for us. And we looked at all that He went through in that week. And we finished that up, and we started talking about spiritual gifts and how we serve and how we can have maximum service. So here's, and it's so, I love it when God puts everything together, right? I think of that the old A-Team TV show, right? The end of every episode, Hannibal would light a cigar, right? Well, obviously, I'm not a good fundamental Baptist because I'm referencing a cigar. I know. God forbid. He would take a cigar, he'd bite the end off, he'd clip the end off, and he'd light it, and he'd say, I love it when a plan comes together. Well, I love it when God's plans come together because he laid this all out amazingly. So we're talking about a life of service. How your life needs to be a life of service. If you look at Samuel's life, he was dedicated and set aside for what? Service of God. Our lives as Christians need to be set aside, need to be dedicated as service to God. And it's really cool. We have 4 graduates. And I like doing it when everybody was in here because it gives the little kids something to look forward to when they get older, this, that, and the other thing. But one of the things that they've had to wrestle with is, what am I going to do with my life? We used to ask the little kids this question. Well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Dan still hasn't answered that question because he still hasn't grown up. Right? What am I supposed to be doing? And I've challenged you to ask yourself the question, where am I supposed to be serving? And in church, we talk about this word called. We've been called to serve. We use it typically in reference to pastors, right? Oh, they are calling a pastor. When 8 years ago, Faith Bible Church called me to become their pastor. We talk about this idea of calling as this is what we're supposed to be doing, right? I've given you guys my story of how God called me into ministry, right? We tend to keep it, make it a churchy ministry type term. But the idea of a calling upon a person's life is something for every Christian. And sometimes it's hard to answer the question, where am I called? Why hasn't God talked to me? Why hasn't God shown me what I need to be doing? Well, I need to know where your pastor's on my butt to fill out these stupid service surveys, and I don't know where I'm called to serve. Have you asked? Hang on. I talked too much to Dan, I guess, today because I'm trying to get my cart before my horse here, and he normally does that to me, and he's not. I'm doing it to myself this morning. So let's talk about that. 1 Samuel chapter 3. Now, here's the thing. We're going to come back and we're going to finish chapter 2 in a few weeks. The reason we're going to finish chapter 2 in a few weeks is because that's where we're going for Father's Day. Okay? So we're going to finish chapter 2 for Father's Day. And we're going to talk about, see how Eli was a no good, rotten dad. No, I'm kidding. Well, kind of. Wait in 2 weeks and you'll find out. We're going to start at chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. And at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said to him, "Here I am." And ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down, and the Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down. And if he calls you, you say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood, calling as other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do things in Israel, that which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. And on that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning the house. For from beginning to the end, and I declared to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear that to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." And Samuel lay down until morning, and he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called to Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." And he said, "Here I am." And Eli said, "What is it that he told you? Do not hide from me. May God do so to you, and more also if you hide anything from me." All of that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Where am I called? This is the calling of Samuel into full-out prophetic prophet ministry. We ask ourselves and we say, "God, why aren't you answering me?" Have you ever asked God that question? "God, you're not telling me where I'm supposed to be serving. God, you're not telling me anything." Where are you called? There are some hindrances. There are 3 hindrances I see in this text that show us why we might not be getting an answer to this basic question. Where am I called? Where am I called? First one I find in the first 7 verses. I'm just going to walk down through this with you. Hopefully Judah can read this. He was having a hard time reading the cursive language. So Miss Laura, you might want to double check about thinking about passing that boy. Right? It's not been revealed yet. God hasn't told you where you're called to yet because he hasn't told you yet. You don't know because he hasn't told you yet. Boy, it's miserable waiting for God to call you to something. September, I think it was probably like the 10th of 2014. Means absolutely nothing to y'all, but it means something to me. On the way back from our anniversary trip, first anniversary trip from Massachusetts, we were on 88 from Albany to Oneonta because we were going to stop by. Cindy was living in Oneonta at the time, so we were going to stop by there on our way home. And Amy and I had a discussion about maybe we were thinking, particularly Amy said, I think it might be time God might be moving us on from West Endicott as being the youth pastor here. And I said, okay. And we had a conversation. And that night we prayed and we asked God, do you want us to move on? And we didn't hear anything for like 2 weeks. Those are miserable 2 weeks. Because I didn't hear it. There's a few key verses here in the first 7 verses that I want you to notice. Verse 1 and verse 7 in particular. Look at verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. The word rare here has the idea of infrequent. It's not that God wasn't talking, it wasn't coming very much. You ever feel like you've been in those times? Here he's serving at Eli's advancing years. We see that out of verse 2. Later in chapter 4, we find out that Eli had, for the total of his life, judged Israel for 40 years. We see Samuel serving already as an attendant. He's taking care of the lampstand in the tabernacle. He's laying in the tabernacle. It was scarce. There's no frequent revelation. Then look at verse 7. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had yet to be revealed. The idea of revealed there is the word uncovered. God had not revealed, had not uncovered himself to Samuel yet. He had not spoken to him directly yet. This is him saying, he hasn't heard yet. God hasn't shared it. We know that he's serving, and we know that he is growing in favor with God. 1 Samuel 2:26 says, now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. We've spent a lot of time over the past 8 weeks talking about how God has uniquely designed you and uniquely given you spiritual gifts that are designed to be used for the betterment of the church. He has a calling for you. He has a ministry for you. Well, why might God not have revealed it yet? You might not have asked. Let me ask you this. Have you asked God where you're to be serving at Faith Bible Church? As you filled out that service survey, were you like, Lord, show me what I need to be doing. Show me what I need to be doing. Because you know what? God may say, you might say, well, I'm not supposed to do da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? And God may say, oh, yes, you are. It's kind of fitting. We're on the last 2 weeks. So this week and next week, growth groups will end next week. They'll be the end, and we will be basically just doing Sunday mornings for the summer. And I remember when we were working all the logistics out for this, and we had to start youth group. And I looked at Kyle and I said, Kyle, how do you feel about doing youth ministry? He said, I think you should find somebody else. That was not necessarily on Kyle's purview to go into youth ministry. But I think even he will agree with me in this, that we can see that God has definitely called him to youth ministry at Faith Bible Church. Have you asked? Have you asked? You know, we 3-year-old, right? 3-year-old kid, he'll come up and say, I want blank. And we'll go say, how do you ask? Sometimes we go to God and we say, God, you do this for me. And he goes, how do you ask? Sometimes we don't know the calling of God in our lives for service because God hasn't yet revealed it to us. The second reason that we don't know where we're called to is this: we're slow to recognize. We're slow to recognize. Look at verse 8. And the Lord called again Samuel, and Samuel rose and went to Eli, and he said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you, lie down. Sorry, that was verse 6. The Lord called again to Samuel, and he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived, then Eli understood that God was the one trying to get a hold of Samuel. Eli finally figured it out on the third try. Here's the problem. Eli is the high priest. Eli is the guy who's supposed to be the closest with God. Eli is the guy who is judging. He is like the think less. When you think of the word judge in this time, think less robes and think more Avengers. Okay? That's kind of the better way of looking at it. Eli, if anybody, should have known that God was the one trying to get a hold of Samuel. But yet his spiritual dullness made him slow to recognize that it was God trying to do it. How many times are you and I spiritually dull and God's trying to tell us something, but our spiritual dullness is so much to the point, it's got us so dull to what God has in God's voice that God says, fine, I'll blow out the titanium baseball bat. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get it then. So many times we in church pretend to be so spiritual that we're spiritually dull. I kind of think of it like this. The book of Hebrews says that we are to rightly divide the word of truth. The idea of dividing in that verse has the idea of cutting through. And I was talking about this in Sunday school, and I referenced the mountain passes in northern Pennsylvania. You know, on Route 81, you've got those places where you've got rock walls and they go up above your car on either side and they cut through. That's the idea. So let me ask you this question. Part of dividing the word of truth is for God to show us calling, to show us what we should be doing in our lives, right? So imagine trying to rightly divide the word of truth with a prop knife. You guys know what a prop knife is? It's basically, there are several different kinds of prop knives, but there are two major ones. One's is just a rubber blade and it'll bend, so it'll fold half on itself. So if I were to go up with a prop knife like that and try to stab Dan, it's just going to bend itself around, but it's going to look like I'm stabbing Dan, right? They also have prop knives that are retractable, so there's like a little, it's spring loaded. So as you go and you stab it, it just folds itself up and into itself, right? So think about this. Try dividing the rock and the shale of northern Pennsylvania, or shoot, don't even have to go that far. Go get a dull shovel on the hill here and try at it. Try doing that with a prop knife. Isn't that us sometimes when we're trying to divine what God would have for us to do? We're so spiritually dull that we're the prop knife and we're trying to dig through the depth of the Word of God and we ain't getting anything. You'll get somewhere, but it's going to be slow going. We so oftentimes are just like Eli. Sometimes we don't know the calling of God in our lives because we're slow to recognize that God's the one who's actually trying to get a hold of us. Verse 11, 10, 11, down to verse about 14, is this God talking to Samuel and laying out his plan for the family, Eli and his family. And he lays out a pretty grim, to say the least, prophecy of what's going to happen. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes versions of the second half of chapter 2. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, right? Yes, Hophni and Phinehas, were stealing things that parts of sacrifices that rightly belong to God. They were raping women, both that were coming to worship and those that were there to serve around the tabernacle. They were defiling God's holy spot. And when Eli just tried to do a, now, boys, you shouldn't do this. And they obviously didn't listen to that. So God says that's it. So God actually sends a prophet in the end of chapter 2. Like I said, 2 weeks, we're going to talk about this in more length. So God sends a prophet and says that he's going to wipe off Eli's house. Notice Samuel's response, verse 15. Samuel lay until morning, then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Whoo! Okay, if God told you, hey, God's gonna, I'm gonna wipe out this whole family, how many of you are gonna be like, yeah, sign me up to go tell them? Would you be able to sleep the rest of the night? And here you have Samuel laying there, not able to go to sleep because he was afraid to tell Eli the truth. Sometimes we don't know where we're called because we're too afraid of the message. We're afraid to ask the question, where am I called? Because God might send me to Africa. Or even scarier, God might require me to look at my coworkers and say, you're no good, rotten, dirty sinner, and you need Jesus to save you. And that just maybe might affect how they view me. See, sometimes we don't hear the message. We don't know where we're called because we're too afraid of what God's going to actually call us to do. God might call me to go be a pastor somewhere. God may call me to go teach Sunday school. God might call me to do something that I don't want to do. Who's God? And who are you to tell God anything? A couple of interesting things here that I had to research out, and I want you to be made aware of because I don't want you going, well, that's really weird, Fraven. Look at, on that day I will fulfill, verse 12, against Eli, all that I have spoken concerning this house from beginning to end, and I declare to him that I am about to punish the house of Israel forever for the iniquity that he knew because the sins were blaspheming God. If you look just before that, at verse 11, behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. So I read this and I'm like, Is this is this like Spider-Man? Like, is this like, you know, pre-knowing what's gonna, like, what? So I looked it up. The idea of tingle has the idea of resonating, ringing, or causing to quiver. When I read this and when I understood what this word tingle means, I immediately thought of Steve. Because he says he always has a ringing in his ear. What God was about ready to do was going to make every ear in Israel ring. Constantly. That's, like, this is major stuff. By the way, we find out what that is in chapter 4. In chapter 4, we find out that God allows the Philistines to capture the Ark of the Covenant and to take it. Whoo-wee. Do you think Samuel has a reason to be afraid to tell Eli and the people about this message? Notice Eli's response down in verse 18. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." Whether this is Eli accepting his fate or coming to the realization that he had majorly messed up is unclear. Let me ask you this question. Are you going to be afraid to hear? Or are you going to accept what God has for you? God has a way of always making sure he gets what he wants. My dad used to say this: we can do this the easy way or the hard way. How much are we like that with God in our calling? Where we're like, you know what? I don't want to. Sometimes we don't hear or recognize what God has called us to do because we do not like the message that God has given to us. I think about the children's book by Dr. Seuss, Green Eggs and Ham. One of my dad's favorites. If you read that book, some of you, it might have been a while. Dan, it was probably this morning. The whole book is about, hey, why don't you try this Green Eggs and Ham? You might like it. And it gives all of these random kooky scenarios in which you could try green eggs and ham. And in the end, the guy's like, fine, if it makes you shut up, I'll try it. And in the end, what does he say? I like it. I like green eggs and ham. You know what? If God's called you to it, even if you don't like it, you might just learn to enjoy it. But it means surrendering what you want for what he wants. So let me ask you a question. Where are you called? Have you heard? Do you know it, and are you rejecting it? Do you know it? Or are you coming to realize it? Has it been slow? Is there spiritual dullness that you need to take care of and sharpen yourself up against the Word of God? Spend some time in confession and allow God to do His thing and sharpen you up to the point so that way you can do what? Go discern it? Or have you heard and you're too scared of what God's calling you to do, so you're like, I'll pass, God. The longer you say that, the longer you step back in fear, the longer you say no, the more blessings you're missing out on. And I bet you if I polled all of you would say, yeah, I don't want to miss on the blessings of God. They're always the best. That means also sometimes doing what's uncomfortable. Ask yourself the question, why haven't you heard where you're called? Ask yourself the simple question, one simple little question. Where am I called by God to serve His church? Let's pray. Father God, I thank you so much. I thank you that you have placed a calling on all of our lives to serve. Lord, I thank you for the calling of you in salvation, that we can participate and enjoy the goodness of your salvation. Lord, this morning I want to ask that if there's somebody here who doesn't know you, Lord, help draw them to yourself. Bring them, call them to yourself. Lord, you work in a mighty way to save an individual. Lord, then another brother or sister comes to know you. We gain more in the family. Lord, maybe you haven't revealed to us yet what our calling is, but Lord, maybe, just maybe we're too spiritually dull to hear it. So Lord, I ask that you would sharpen us up to hear from you. Father, I ask that we would never be too afraid of what you have for us to do, to serve you, to step up. And may we live a life of obedience to you.